My mother-in-law lifted the ceremonial bow out of the guild president's hand before he'd finished announcing my name, held it up over her head like she'd just won it in a raffle, and told 200 people packed into the symphony hall's atrium that she was the one who had taught me to build violins, in her own garage, when I was 23 years old. My name is Sylvie. My husband is Theo. My mother-in-law is Marguerite, and in the 11 years I've known her, I have never once seen her pick up a chisel, a plane, or so much as a tube of hide glue without asking someone else to open it for her first. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, and it comes back around before the night is over. Tonight I was being certified as a Master Luthier by the Cascadia Violin Makers Guild, one of maybe 6 people the regional guild certifies in a given year, in the same ceremony where I was unveiling the concert violin I'd spent 14 months building on commission for Ank Voss, the City Symphony's new concertmaster. But the person who actually taught me to build a violin was Radovan Fisher, who held a Master Luthier certification for 31 years and sponsored exactly 3 apprentices in that time, because the guild only lets a sponsoring master take 1 apprentice at a stretch, and Radovan never rushed anyone through the 4 years of logged bench hours the certification requires. I was his third. I started at 23, sweeping spruce shavings and cutting purfling channels by hand in exchange for 1 evening a week learning to read the grain of a maple backplate, and it took the full 4 years, every hour logged and countersigned, before the guild examiners signed off on my journeyman rank, let alone tonight's. The claim didn't start tonight. It started almost 4 years ago, at a small open bench day I held when I first passed my journeyman exam, when Marguerite told one of my new customers, a retired schoolteacher named Odette who'd come in asking about a repair, that she'd gotten Sylvie started on woodworking back when I was too nervous to hold a gouge on my own. Odette mentioned it to me afterward, warmly, assuming it was true and that I'd simply never brought it up. I laughed it off. Marguerite had never once mentioned owning so much as a sanding block in the 11 years I'd known her. It kept happening in small doses after that. At Theo's birthday dinner, she told his cousins she'd put the idea in my head one winter at her old house, watching a documentary about violin makers with me curled up on her couch. At her book club, she told the group she'd kept a workbench in her 20s and shown me the basics before I ever met that man with the shop, which is how she always referred to Radovan, never by name. Theo rolled his eyes every time and told me to let it go, that this was just his mother wanting a piece of something she found impressive. I mostly let it go, because arguing with Marguerite about anything cost more than it was worth, and because for a long time the claim only reached people who had no reason to check it. That changed about 8 months ago, when Marguerite started showing up to my monthly beginner workshops uninvited, standing near the back in a silk scarf, and correcting my student's gouge angle in a voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. Steeper, dear, that's not how I taught Sylvie to cut a channel. My students didn't know what to make of it. 2 of them later asked my shop assistant, a conservatory dropout named Farid, whether Marguerite used to run the workshop. Farid told me about it that same afternoon, clearly uncomfortable, and asked if he should say something directly. I told him not yet. I still thought this was vanity, not something that could actually cost me anything, and I didn't want a fight with my husband's mother over a story that felt, at the time, more embarrassing than dangerous. The turn happened when Marguerite gave an interview. A regional arts quarterly, Cascadia Strings, was doing a feature on the symphony's new concert violin ahead of tonight's gala, and the writer, a friendly enough man named Julian who'd clearly never covered anything more contentious than a chamber recital, asked around for color, anyone with a personal angle on how I got my start. Somebody, I still don't know who, gave him Marguerite's number. She told Julian, on the record, that she'd introduced me to woodworking as a young woman in her own garage, that she'd always known I had an ear for wood the way some people have an ear for pitch, and that watching me build an instrument for the symphony's concertmaster felt like watching her own patience with me finally pay off. Julian printed it almost verbatim, 3 paragraphs in, under a photo of my new bench. He never called me to check the claim, because it wasn't presented as a claim, it was presented as a proud mother-in-law's quote, harmless color for a feel-good piece. Radovan saw it first. He called me at 7 in the morning, and I could hear in his voice that he was trying to keep it light and not quite managing it. Sylvie, who in the hell is Marguerite, and why does Cascadia Strings think she taught you to cut an F-hole? I read him the paragraph over the phone. He was quiet for a second and then he laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. Radovan had sponsored me for 4 full years, logging every bench session and every tool lesson in his own careful hand, and now a woman he'd never met was in print taking that from him. In the same season the guild was putting his name on a plaque as the region's longest-serving sponsor. I called Marguerite. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, why she told a magazine writer she'd taught me violin making when she knew that wasn't true. She didn't apologize. She said she'd always felt drawn to my instruments somehow, that she used to take me to a luthier's open house at the county fair as a young woman, which had happened exactly once, and I'd gone with my own mother, not her, and that she didn't see what the big deal was if it made a nicer story for the magazine. Theo tried to talk to her too, and got a version of the same non-answer, plus a comment about how I was too sensitive about who gets credit for what for someone who was about to be a Master Luthier. I decided, that week, that I wasn't going to let this die down quietly the way it had every other time. Not because of my own ego about it, I genuinely don't need public credit for my own 4 years of sweeping shavings and ruining maple in the process of learning to bend it, but because Radovan had spent 3 decades training apprentices for almost nothing out of a converted garage with a wood stove that barely worked, and I was not going to stand in a hall where his name was going up on a plaque and let his one clean legacy line get quietly handed to somebody who wouldn't true a bow without asking someone else to check it first. So I went looking for the one thing that would settle it without a shouting match, the guild-mandated apprenticeship ledger Radovan had kept on me from my very first evening, the one every apprentice in the region is required to maintain, weekly bench hours and tool competencies entered in my own hand and countersigned by Radovan every single session, the one with my registration number on the spine and 4 full years of dated entries inside. I found it exactly where it had always been, on the shelf above my own bench, because the guild requires you to keep it for inspection for at least 10 years after certification. Radovan had the cover rebound in book cloth at a shop downtown years ago, half as a joke and half because he said if the guild was going to make us keep it, we might as well keep it properly. Tonight, Marguerite waited until the ribbon on the display case had been cut and the guild president had opened the floor for a few short remarks, mine for the certification, Radovan's as the region's longest-serving sponsor, Anks as the concertmaster receiving her new instrument, and then, while I was still walking back from accepting my Master Luthier certificate, she reached over, lifted the ceremonial bow out of the guild president's hand before he'd fully let go of it, and told the crowd she wanted to say a few words as the woman who started all this. She said she'd taught me to build violins in her own garage before I ever set foot in Radovan's shop, that watching this instrument go to the symphony felt like watching her own patience finally get recognized, and that she hoped everyone would remember, when they heard Ank play tomorrow night, whose hands had first shown mine what to do. The crowd did the polite thing a crowd of strangers does when a stranger's older relative says something sentimental at a podium. A soft round of applause, a few awa-s, someone's phone lifted to film it. My apprentices, who knew better, went very still. Farid looked at me. Radovan looked at the ground. I walked back up to the podium and asked the guild president, quietly, if I could add one more thing. He handed me the bow without hesitation, since he had no idea anything was wrong. I told the crowd that I loved my mother-in-law, and that I understood why a story like the one she'd just told was a nice one to want to be part of. Then I said that the violin behind the glass exists because Radovan Fisher, standing right there in the cardigan he'd worn to every guild dinner for 30 years, has never once trusted memory over a ledger. I held up the rebound apprenticeship book, angled it so the closest phone cameras could actually read it, and read the spine out loud. Apprentice Luthier ledger, my registration number, 4 years of dated entries, rate of Anne's counter signature next to every single session. Starting the autumn I was 23, I said that as far as that ledger was concerned, and as far as the Guild's own certification file was concerned, there had only ever been one sponsor in this region who'd logged the hours, and he'd been sitting at that table the entire night wondering if anyone was going to say his name out loud. Then I asked Radovan to stand, and the applause this time wasn't polite. It went on long enough that the guild president had to gesture for the hall's photographer to actually get it on camera for the association newsletter. Marguerite didn't storm out. She's not a storm-out kind of woman. She prefers to leave a room believing she's the only one who noticed she was leaving. She set her wine glass down on the nearest table, told a cluster of Theo's cousins that the evening had turned ugly over nothing, and left through the side door near the coat check 20 minutes before the reception actually ended. Theo found her in the parking lot and they had a conversation I wasn't part of and don't need to be. He told me afterward, in the car, that he'd finally said out loud what he should have said years ago, that she doesn't get to keep doing this, and that the next time she tries to rewrite what happened in front of people who matter to us, he's not going to soften it for her afterward the way he has every other time. Julian from Cascadia Strings ran a short correction online 2 days later, quoting Radovan directly this time, along with a photo of the ledger's spine. Marguerite hasn't mentioned the garage workbench since. She still comes to family dinners, and Theo and I have decided we're not going to make a production out of freezing her out, because that's its own kind of exhausting, and because I'd rather spend that energy training this year's apprentice than managing a feud. But Radovan keeps a photocopy of that ledger page taped up inside the shop now, right next to his sponsor plaque, and every new apprentice who asks about it gets the same answer from him. The guild doesn't care who tells the best story at a podium. It only cares whose hand actually signed the hours, so keep yours signed.